Welcome to ORF. We are, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We have gathered here as part of as part of this organization today to launch a report that ORF has done on Iranian nuclear deal and the consequences of US withdrawal as it impacts India. A number of our researchers contributed to this report. This is one of the most comprehensive reports that at least I have seen coming out in the Indian public policy circles, examining the impact on India of this withdrawal from multiple perspectives. And we are very grateful for Shri Ranjan Mathai to be here today with us to launch this report formally. This report is already on our website, so those of you who don't, if you don't have a hard copy today, hard copies are lying outside. If you don't have a hard copy, please go on our website to read this report. Can I formally ask Shri Mathai to launch this just for our photo opportunity? Thank you, sir. I think we have a few researchers here who are also there. Thank you. We have a few of the writers here, and I'll leave it to Abhijnan to name them and to discuss their contribution to the report. I'll very briefly talk about the background and a few issues that sort of emerged out of this report and sort of the broader context in which we have sort of dealt with this, given the stakes that are there, in this, in this emerging scenario, both for India, for Iran, for the international community, and for our other partners in Europe, in US, and also in the Middle East. As we all know, it has become a cliche now to suggest that this is an age of disruption, and as part of this disruptive process, what we have seen, one of the first things Mr. Trump did was, apart from explaining or making it clear the disdain he had for the nuclear deal, which was signed by his predecessor, he decided to formally withdraw from the deal. And that is a reality now that we are trying to grapple with. All those who are involved in the public policy space are trying to examine what are going to be the consequences in their respective spaces. And of course, the impact on India is bilateral because we have relations both with America and with Iran, which will be impacted. But I think there are other broader dimensions as well, which I think emerge out of what is happening with this withdrawal. One is, and three fundamental questions, very broadly conceptual questions that emerge. One is, of course, structural question. I think this is an age when we have talked of, it is often talked of world as becoming multipolar. And if that is the case, then I think this is becoming a test case now almost, whether powers like the European Union, China, India, Russia, can do something about, can provide an alternative. So what Mr. Trump has done is a very unilateral decision on, as he saw fit as part of his national interest imperatives. And now it is for others to react to that. So in that context, what the debate about where the structural realities are shifting and where the structural debate is going in terms of the international order and what possibilities emerge, I think it will be very interesting to see what happens. We are looking at a certain context in which Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and other actors like India, who were not part of the deal directly, but who have a stake in the deal, have made it clear that they would like this deal to continue. And I think there are some suggestions now of negotiations happening. We have heard there is still disappointment in Iran at what is being offered as an alternative. So I think there is a broader question about what kind of an alternative order these emerging powers could present in this context, where this withdrawal from the nuclear deal is almost becoming a test case. And so the implications in that context become very significant, both for the institutional order as well as the normative order that the world is getting accustomed to. Institutionally, I think also this raises very significant questions about our ability to build institutional frameworks, our ability to hold on to regimes which perhaps reflect more than just the balance of power realities. Ultimately, if international institutions have to survive, everyone has to have a stake in those institutions and those regimes. And I think in this case in particular, what we have witnessed, that a lot when this deal was signed, the argument was that this deal is going to somehow has brought relatively disparate powers together in an attempt to manage a very thorny problem, which was a problem of Iranian nuclear Iranian nuclear aspirations. So how do you manage that in the context? And in this context, the issue of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty becomes very important. Are we looking at a fundamental realtering in the nuclear order? If excuse me, if Iran goes nuclear, then what are the implications for that order? And this deal represented a mechanism, an institutional mechanism, by which the major powers tried to sort of restructure that arrangement to the degree that they saw fit at that particular point in time. So the reneging of this deal raises, again, important questions about the institutional frameworks that are open to us, that are now being looked at. And I think, finally, normative frameworks in terms of global governance. If we are to look at a new global order where global governance issues are becoming more important, then this deal also represents a way of managing certain global governance issues. So where does that fit in terms of where we are going and what our normative discourse is going to be about managing international order and international politics? And I think that those are sort of the larger questions that this withdrawal sort of raises and engages with. As far as bilateral issues are concerned, India and Iran ties and the role of the US has been a long-standing issue. It's not an issue that has just emerged for us. This has been a policy debate in India for a long time now, and especially what, in the context, like other countries, US has placed demands on India with respect to India's ties with third countries for a long time. And in this case, Iran particularly was very interesting and central question during the US-India nuclear deal debate. Any account of the US-India nuclear deal, if you read, if you go through, if you were part of that debate, if you have heard about it or read about it, you would see how this Iranian question was central to what was happening in the US and India dynamic, and what was also happening with the Iran-India dynamic at that particular point in time. And India managed to make a case that India would not abide by bilateral sanctions. So multilaterally, whatever was happening at the UN level, that was something that India was party to, but not the sort of unilateral sanctions that America had imposed on Iran. So the larger strategic narrative about US-India relations at that particular point in time was the one that won this debate. So if you go back and if you read about the nuclear deal, you would find that the way both Manmohan Singh government here in Delhi and the George W. Bush administration in Washington presented or moved ahead of the curve on the Iranian question was by arguing that US-India nuclear deal is actually about the larger strategic picture that comes out of that is coming out of in the larger global politics, and therefore that larger strategic narrative, the larger impetus behind US ties with India and what it means for the larger strategic framework was the one that was sold both by both our respective governments in New Delhi and Washington, and that won the day at that particular point in time. Mr. Trump's approach, as we all know, is very transactional in that context. It's not entirely evident that the strategic argument that India had made then would also apply, can also make any impact today. However, it must be acknowledged that at that point in time, the demands that were being made in India were very unilateral, were happening in a bilateral context. Today, the demands that are being made on India from America are not happening in a bilateral context. They are happening in a sort of a multilateral context, in the sense that America is making same demands on every country. It is not entirely targeted at India. So therefore, the arguments around nuclear deal are not specific to India. In fact, India is peripheral at this point because India was not party to the Jcpoa agreement. So in that sense, there is a degree of shift. There is a change in where India sits in at this point. But clearly, stakes are high because India's ties with Iran have been multidimensional. It is not simply about energy. It is about energy. Energy is part of the relationship, but it is also about much more. More recently, we have started talking of Chabahar as the focal point of India-Iran relations and what it means for India's footprint in Central Asia through Afghanistan, what it means for India's relationship with other countries in the region in the Middle East. Of course, what also it impacts is India's relations with countries, major powers like China and Russia. So we have that dynamic also, which is at play, that it is not simply about India, Iran, and US. And this is also reflected in the report, where we have engaged with this issue of China and Russia as part of this larger dynamic on the nuclear deal. So they are all implicated in this context where we are looking at India-Iran relations from a broader perspective, not simply from the perspective of energy. Energy is part of the mix. Energy is a large part of the mix. And I think a lot of the debates in the media that we are witnessing today are largely about energy. But I think India-Iran relationship is much more than that. And therefore, the debates and the discussion has to be much more than just simply how much oil we are buying and what impact it will have on India's energy security. So therefore, this report has tried to examine the implications for India in a very comprehensive manner. We have 12 researchers, both some of our most senior researchers like Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who has written on the nuclear proliferation. Also some of our younger researchers who have joined us more recently and who have looked at what other specific issue areas, including China and Russia, which I think Abhijnan will elaborate on. So I think I will rest there and I will let Abhijnan talk a bit about my colleague Abhijnan Rej, who is a co-editor with me on this report, will elaborate on some of the key aspects of this report and also about other researchers who have written on specific issue areas.
Well, good morning and thank you for coming. What I'll do is Harsh has laid out the background of the report on why US withdrawal from the JCPOA is significant. What I'll do is I'll run through what is there in the report and the kind of like the highlights. Of course, the report is available online as well as outside, so please pick up a copy. And towards the end, I'll also discuss some of the policy recommendations that came out for Indian policymakers based on the analysis that was presented. So the report, the way we had thought of structuring the report was looking at the US withdrawal from JCPOA, both in terms of the geopolitical impact on India and the region and the world, as well as the geo-economic impact. So there's a strong economics component in the report. The two of the chapters deals with the economic nitty-gritties of sanctions and the state of the Iranian economy and so on and so forth. So the report opens with with an article by Kabir Taneja on the Iranian and regional politics and the impact of US withdrawal from this. What has happened in Iran is that essentially it was the moderates, as you know, that pushed for Iran signing on to JCPOA, right? And you have a strong hardliners in Iran who were not very happy with it. Now, what happens is that now, when the US pulled out of the deal, you're essentially emboldening the hardliners. So Kabir talks about this dynamic a little bit, but he also touches on something very interesting. He said, it's a fundamental question. Why did the US pull out of JCPOA, right? So it's certainly not, strictly violating the terms of JCPOA, which Iran didn't. But it's rather more in terms of the Shia-Sunni balance in the Middle East, right? And Washington's favoring a certain side, the Sunni side, the Saudi side of the deal. And that played into the American decision to withdraw. So Kabir looks at the Iranian and regional political dimensions of the issue. The second chapter of this is by Gautam Chikkermane, who's a vice president at ORF, with Rukba Rai. And this is on the economics of the whole story, right? So this chapter deals both with the Iranian economy as it stands, right? Pre-JCPOA, sanctions regime and post-sanctions regime, pre-JCPOA, post-JCPOA. And also about the India-Iran economic relationship, right? Energy and non-energy. One of the very interesting things that stood out of their analysis is that while lifting sanctions did contribute to an increase in GDP, which was to be expected, more business was happening. If you look at the unemployment rate actually went up So that's a very interesting dynamic. So in terms of on the ground situation about the Iranian economy, uh, what you see is the economy bettered in in a certain measure, which is GDP. But in terms of employment, well, it didn't work really. Why is that the case? So this chapter, Gautam Chakraman and Rukpa, right? They talk about Iran's addiction to oil, and it's essentially an oil-driven economy, right? And this is, by the way, has a lot of political consequence, right? So you have unemployment rate increasing post JCPOA. You have a lot of angry people on the streets. These are the people that the hardliners could tap if the hardliners were to push back and come to Iran. So this is very significant. The other thing that stood out about the Chikramane Rai paper was the intriguing possibility. This just look, if India was to comply with US sanctions, where do we get the oil that we need? And this suggests that maybe the US could help us meet that shortfall through shale. So that's another point in that. In the third chapter, I and a young lawyer, Arshi Tirke, we looked at the issue of secondary sanctions very carefully, and essentially looking at the legal provisions that are there in American law and the impact of secondary sanctions or these legal provisions on India, right? So essentially what is going on with secondary sanctions is this. First, you have something called CAATSA, which was a law that was passed before US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. So this was in January. No, CAATSA came into effect in January. It was passed a little bit before that. So CAATSA is a very catch-all, like national security law that was passed. So it has provisions on North Korea, it has provisions on Russia, but it also has a dedicated section on Iran with a focus on IRGC. And I'll explain to you why that becomes important for India. So CAATSA has an Iran section that potentially could affect us. And then you have the pre-JCPOA laws, CISADA and ILSA, and I'm not going to bore you with all the legal terminology, but there's a whole battery of laws that were already there. They were kind of pushed aside when JCPOA came to effect, but now they are back into play. How does all of this affect India? Well, principally in three ways. One way is you have the issue of Indian investments in Fazad B or South Pars. I know that South Pars has kind of been pushed in the background, but it's not dead. It's there somewhere. Fazad B also, there's a lot of talk about what's going on with Fazad B. These are gas fields, by the way. So with what's going on with Fazad B, but it's there, out there. These will be affected by a provision in CISADA, which prevents countries, foreigners, from investing more than a certain amount in Iran's petroleum industry. So that gets affected there. The second part of this is going to be obviously our energy deals. The petroleum, we are the third largest, or Iran is the third largest source of petroleum for us. So then that gets affected. But more interestingly, CAATSA section 105, a certain provision that deals with the IRGC, could affect us in Chabahar. Because the way things work in Iran, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, have a huge stake in business, right? In construction business in particular. Now, this provision of CAATSA talks about foreign affiliates of the IRGC, and they don't specify what kind of affiliates. So there's a potential that maybe, if Trump was to implement this very aggressively, there's a problem there. The fourth chapter is by Kriti Mathur Shah, who talks about Chabahar, the importance of Chabahar. And the case that Kriti makes is that, listen, Chabahar ultimately benefits Afghanistan. So already because of Chabahar, Iran has become the largest trading partner of Afghanistan, and it's no longer Pakistan. And then obviously there's this issue that you can sort of break the Pakistani blockade, if you wish, of blockade not in a technical sense, but this Pakistani block of trade to Afghanistan and the leverage they have through Chabahar. So that's one thing. But Kriti also points to another very interesting question. They said that, look, if India was not to develop Chabahar, it is very likely that China will get into this, right? And this is not good for the US. It's not good for India, right? So she does this. That's a very interesting point that she makes. The fifth chapter is by Ketan Mehta, who discusses Iran's relationship with China, which is a very interesting thing because China has made serious investments in Iranian infrastructure for a very long time, by the way. Tehran's metro system was built by the Chinese a long time ago. And now, because of the Belt and Road Initiative, China is making a lot of investments in Iran. And by the way, we see no sign that China will comply with the sanctions because the understanding now is that there might be a situation where Iran will accept RMB as payment, the Chinese yuan as payment for oil. So China most likely will just bypass the whole thing. But the defense relationship between Iran and China is also very significant. It's not just supply of weapons, both overtly and covertly. This Ketan explains the covert aspect of it. But it's also weapons design that China has provided to Iran over time. The next chapter is by Kanak Gokaran and Himani Pant, who now look at Russia. So with China done, you look at Russia. And they raise a very interesting point. They said, look, Russia sells arms to Iran, right? But for Russia, it's not a matter of ideology, because Russia also sells arms to Turkey and Saudi Arabia, not exactly Iran's best friends. So there is that sort of Russian pragmatism, if you wish, when it comes to dealing with Iran. But they also point to another issue. They said that, look, Russia has always sought a multipolar world, and Hirsch alluded to this. Russia, it's they call it a polycentric world order. And in this, a very strong Iran is a necessary component as a regional power. So while Russia's approach to Iran might be very pragmatic and very, very transactional, there is that ideological or geopolitical calculation, if you wish, that's there in the back of Russian minds. The second to last chapter is by Britta Peterson, who examines Iran's relationship with Europe. It's very interesting, actually, the analysis that she presents, because she frames the US withdrawal from Jcpoa as the latest installment between this growing rift. You all are following Donald Trump is right now in Europe, and things seem to be not going very well. And so this withdrawal was the latest episode in that widening rift between Europe and Europe and the United States. Mind you, EU was a partner to the Jcpoa. So you had European countries that were partners, but so it's this P5+1, so P5 plus the permanent 5 in the UNSC plus Germany. But EU itself was also a partner or a party to this. So obviously the stakes are very high. But the interesting thing is that what she describes, she says that in terms of commercial dealings between European countries and Iran, you have a very interesting dynamic, which is that European businesses, once it was clear that Donald Trump will become president, or there was a possibility of Donald Trump becoming president, European businesses had already sort of said or taken a position that they would wait and watch and see what happens to Jcpoa. So in terms of actual investments, a lot of European businesses had already kind of mentally prepared themselves for this eventuality. The last chapter is by Rakesh Sood, who talks about the impact of the withdrawal on the non-proliferation regimes. When US pulled out, 2 days after that, one Iranian hardliner, I forget which minister, but he floated the idea that Iran might withdraw from the NPT. Now, the NPT is already under pressure, right? It is already under pressure because it seems that people are thinking of workarounds through the NPT. Then you have this issue of North Korea. So there is a problem. There are pressures on the NPT. So if Iran was to really pull out of the NPT, that would be the end of the NPT. So Ambassador Sood talks about that. He talks about the consequences if Iran was to resume uranium enrichment, right? And how far would they be from a functional bomb, right? And finally, the report concludes with some conclusions, some policy recommendations as conclusions. So I think the policy recommendations were very, in some sense, very straightforward, right? So what should India do? Well, the first thing is India should seek waivers from US from secondary sanctions when it comes to the petroleum import. But we're dealing with Donald Trump, and we are also dealing with a US that is increasingly, not just Donald Trump, but a US that is increasingly very transactional. So what we had proposed is we had said, look, you seek waivers from secondary sanctions, but at the same time, you do this in a quid pro quo way. So you say, fine, give us sanctions, but in return, we'll probably do something with tariffs, which is something that appeals to President Trump. The second recommendation was that New Delhi should really aggressively promote the cause of Chabahar in Washington, D.C., because I think this is something that we have not done enough. And we should go and promote the cause of Chabahar in D.C. by saying that, listen, Chabahar ultimately benefits President Trump's South Asia strategy, right? Because how does it benefit President Trump's South Asia strategy? Well, as I just said, it allows you to bypass Pakistan altogether. So in the AFPAC debate, you're kind of taking care of the PAC part of it and just focusing on Afghanistan. So that was the second recommendation. Now, of course, it may be that none of this works, right? So then what do you do? So then our third recommendation would be that you have to look to other partners when it comes to Chabahar. Chabahar is something that India really cannot drop, right? So who could be a potential partner? Well, maybe China, right? Because already India and China has committed to developing a project in Afghanistan. So it is not completely out of question, especially after the Wuhan quote-unquote reset, that they could partner together and do this. The fourth policy recommendation was that Russia has, over the years, not just now, over maybe last 6, 7, 10 years, promoted the cause of developing alternative mechanisms for financial flows, in particular an alternative to SWIFT, which seems to be the main messaging system through which money transfers are recorded and kept track with. If the US continues to impose unilateral sanctions which have secondary sanctions, then maybe India has to team up with Russia in developing some of these alternative payment structures, or at least leveraging them. Russia, by the way, proposed this to do within the BRICS framework as well, to develop an alternative to SWIFT. And the final recommendation was that, listen, India has to support, if the overtures to US fail, India has to support the French and German positions on the Jcpoa, right? Because for the simple reason that Iran acquiring nuclear weapons changes India's security calculus considerably. Because if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it is almost certain that the Saudis will also acquire nuclear weapons, perhaps with Pakistani help. And then suddenly, on your western borders or to India's west, you have a very complicated security situation. So if overtures to the US fail, then maybe backing the European position on Jcpoa is fine. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Abhijnan. As you see, we have been very bold. Generally, policy papers in Delhi, which are produced by think tanks, do not have policy options. So we are putting everything on the table. So now it is for someone as experienced as Mr. Mathai to tell us where we have gone wrong, or whether we are completely out of kilter, where we are making sense. And also, I think, provoke a debate here as to what perhaps are India's options, because this is primarily about India. This report is written from India's perspective. It has a lot of other countries in the mix, because our relationships, our engagement with Iran is multidimensional. It involves other actors, and so the implications are also multidimensional. So in that context, let me invite Mr. Mathai, and please, sir, we will.
Thank you very much. Due to the vagaries of courier services between Delhi and Gurgaon, I got to see this rather late, in fact, only this morning. So I will do the second part of what he Professor Pant has suggested, which is to try and provoke a debate. But I'll just give some thoughts. Well, I think first of all, anyone who has looked at the Jcpoa and looked at the record of how it was achieved will acknowledge that it was one of the most remarkable attempts through diplomacy, and a successful one, at least for a while, to reduce the salience of what was becoming a truly threatening crisis in the Middle East. And it's a complex set of arrangements. You have to be somebody who knows something about nuclear energy and about enrichment of uranium, heavy water, etc., to be able to understand the full ramifications of what it is. But basically, it put a halt to the Iranian capacity for being as close to nuclear weaponization as they were, but perhaps for a period of 13 to 15 years. And after that, it had left things a little vague. As rightly pointed out, it was criticized by hardliners on all sides. In fact, on the Iranian side, it's sometimes forgotten that the EU had, prior to 2007, actually engaged with Iran and come very close to some kind of an understanding on the EU3, on nuclear energy and what to do about Iran's nuclear program. And it was President Ahmadinejad who came in with a fresh election who actually overturned that. So there's a kind of historic repetition going on here. In as early as October 2017, I think the writing on the wall was there. Mr. Trump indicated that he meant to carry through his promises in the election campaign and post-election when he refused to certify the compliance with the Jcpoa. And in April, both Israel and the US produced what was the smoking gun, as they would call it, to try and demonstrate that by covering up an old program, Iran had in fact failed to keep its side of the bargain. And on 8th May, then Trump went ahead and withdrew from the Jcpoa. Now, I see the withdrawal as, of course, immediately directed at Iran, but as part of Mr. Trump's attempt to shake up the world order in pursuit of United States interests as he sees them. And I think it is on par with his challenge to China on the tariffs question, his provoking and needling his own partners in NATO, and the moves which he has made in Northeast Asia, particularly on Korea. But most significantly, it is yet another American attempt at reshaping the Middle East. There is, I think, in the news that has emerged about the visit of Nikki Haley to Delhi, a very clear expectation of Indian support for what Trump is seeking to do. And therefore, the question remains, what do we do? As has been explained, this study examines how this deal will affect Iranian internal politics, and that's something I'll come back to at the end. But also how it will affect the maneuverings between the players in the Middle East, or West Asia as we call it, in this grand American scheme to try and create a new order there. On oil markets and how India will be impacted by sanctions, we know a little bit about that. We dealt with it quite extensively, and both the primary and secondary sanctions. We did, in an earlier phase, find some leeway for a while. But this time round, whether we will be able to get that leeway is an open question. I agree that the reactions of China and Russia and Europe will be very, very central to how we will be able to proceed in this matter. I think it is becoming slightly clear that all these three major players do recognize one thing, that this time round, the sanctions have a much stronger political push, which is aimed not only at dealing with the Iran nuclear question, but at larger issues dealing with Iran itself. So I think there's going to be a degree of caution among all the players on the extent to which they will take on Mr. Trump and the manner in which they will choose to do it. I think the study on global non-proliferation is certainly what this withdrawal means for the global non-proliferation regime is, I think, very, very significant. And Rakesh's contribution is his usual very, very penetrating insights on what the NPT means, how it is being held together, where the challenges will come from, and what the implications of its unraveling are. I think that's something which is very significant, and I would recommend it for reading by all. I think in the policy recommendations which have been made, I agree that we'll have to negotiate with the US, and we might seek waivers. But we have already reduced our oil purchases from Iran as part of the negotiations over Farzad B. So I think the requirement for seeking the waivers purely in terms of managing the oil market in India will be gradually of lesser significance than they were in the 2011-13 period when I was dealing with it. But we do have, of course, the problem that some of our refineries are specifically geared to the Iranian quality of oil, and that may require some technical handling. Whether we can soften the attitude of the US by offering to buy more from them or work with tariffs, I think this time round it seems to me unlikely. They are very, very determined about this. Promoting the cause of Chabahar in Washington, yes, it's another thing we did do very intensively during that period, in the earlier period. I personally have gone to Washington and spoken to people there about Chabahar. And I do believe that it is very intimately linked to how the Pentagon views the requirements in Afghanistan going forward. But that said, I understand President Trump has ordered yet another review of the Afghan policy. So whether his South Asia strategy announced with such aplomb a little earlier will survive remains to be seen. Collaboration with China on Chabahar, that is indeed a possibility. But whether China would collaborate in a manner which gives us the kind of leeway we want in deciding how Chabahar will be used, I'm not so sure. But I agree that Russia is the one partner with whom we need to engage very strongly in managing the outcome of the American withdrawal. I believe when Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin meet, which is, I think, in a few days' time, Iran will be very high on the agenda. And we need to wait and watch to see which way Mr. Putin really swings on this. There are indications that Russian policy does value Iran, certainly as a potential pole in world politics. But at the same time, there have been some straws in the wind suggesting that Russia would not mind a diminution of Iranian influence, particularly in Syria, but across the Middle East. And it may have something to do with Russia's determination to remain the principal gas supplier to Europe and leave the Iranians out. But as I said, we will know in a week's time. Supporting France and Germany, particularly in case the United States is not forthcoming in our attempts, I think this is something, again, which is well within our grasp. We have fairly intensive dialogues with both countries. We know that both countries have announced, along with Britain, a determination, at least till a month ago, to stay on course on the Jcpoa and try to make it work. But as Abhijnan said, Individual companies have already taken notice, and in fact, the withdrawal of Total, I think, has really from Iran has really taken the Iranians, if not by surprise, but has really made them sit up and take notice. I think this is a useful and timely study. It considers where we are on oil dependency, on Farzad B, on Chabahar, etc. And as I said, we had worked on variations on all these themes in an earlier period. But in looking at the recommendations, and this is where I'm going to end and leave it, we need to keep in mind that we may be seeing a much more dangerous phase in the US-Iran confrontation, and hence the United States' determination to enforce its sanctions. Is the US trying to curb or contain the Iranian nuclear program, or is it looking for regime change in Tehran? And I think that is where we will be able to decide where to go. And in saying that, I will conclude with only one comment. When you look at the timelines which have been given, August 6th, the first set of sanctions, and by November 4th, everybody has to comply. Why November 4th? It is, of course, 3 months, but it is the anniversary of the takeover of the United States Embassy in 1979. November 4th, 1979. There's a symbolism there, which I think Trump has kept in mind. Thank you.
It's gratifying to know that some of these recommendations actually, are workable, and there is some merit to it. So with that, I open this floor for your questions, comments, critique, observations. The floor is all yours. Yes, sir.
I have my name. Basic questions, in fact, on the.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Brigadier Khanna is my name. Okay. And basic question is this: that the international pacts are signed, like say the one with here, this is there, and the earlier one, when the climate change with all of a sudden the pull out, somebody takes. Is there no, in fact, penalties which is required to be given on that particular, or just because the USA happen to be in fact so far, they can just pull out and then have an implication of that only, or is it only one person's in fact whims and fancy the whole world is doing to it? I mean, that part of it also has to be seen. Is it US will or is it Trump's will? Thank you.
Suresh Goyal, former Foreign Service. My question basically comes from the fact highlighted in the report itself, and the sense is that Iran is I would think critical, important for India's own energy security as well as connectivity to Central Asia. Now, in terms of energy security, while we can look at the substitutes and we can think of the possible replacement by shell from USA, etc., my question really comes from the concern that we seem to have a dependence on Iran, which is not at all easily replaceable in the kind of the current calculus that we have. So we may go to Russia, we may go to China, but going to Russia or China is actually, in that sense, diminishing our own strategic primacy in our own schemes of connectivity. If we go to China as a partner, we are essentially really leading on China. So my question is that we seem to have come up in a situation where not only currently we don't seem to have many options, but to fall in line with the US pressures to abide by the sanctions, but also that this kind of a thing will be diminishing our options for the future. And particularly in the post-sanctions situation, ultimately, kabhi na kabhi to subah aayegi hi. And when the subah comes, where will India be vis-a-vis Iran? Till today, I mean, when we were dealing with Iran before 2000, 2015, it was a better situation. Iran had been going through sanctions, and therefore we had been able to worked out the arrangement. This time it seems more difficult, as the former Foreign Secretary Mathai himself explained. So where will we be? That is my concern. And how do we really try and develop options that we are not left high and dry in that post-sanctions regime? Thank you.
So, I have a couple of observations, and maybe there's some questions also contained in that. Uh, Mr. Mathai spoke about we don't know whether the Americans are interested in regime change or it's purely about the nuclear issue. But whether it's regime change or the nuclear issue, I think both are equally important to us. So if there's a regime change and you have a much more enlightened or moderate regime in Iran, I think it works well for us. And if the Iranians are deprived of their nuclear weapons program, I think that works well for us. So, in that sense, in some ways, our interests align with the American interests. The second is that I think the real truth we have to confront as Indians is that we are getting out of our comfort zone. We've had this walking the middle path, a bit with the Americans, bit with the Iranians kind of a deal. I think that comfort zone is ending. We need to start picking up sides. And then we have to see who brings what to the table, which means that we need to examine some strategic shibboleths which we have nurtured for at least the last 70 years, if not longer. Uh, you know, what does Iran bring to the table? I think Gautam's paper brings that out very well. It's 1% of our total trade. How does it stack up in terms of energy security? Okay, fine, we buy $10 billion of oil from Iran, maybe a couple of $100 million of investments, and these days refineries can process all sorts of crude by changing a few parameters. Not a big deal. We can do that, which gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of how we operate on our oil markets. Um, and then there was a time in the 90s when the Iranians were our allies as far as Afghanistan was concerned. I'm not sure if they are our allies anymore. Um, will the Iranians actually want to play ball with us as far as Chabahar is concerned, in the way the Pakistanis will be playing ball with the Chinese on Gwadar, virtually giving off the port to them, virtually, becoming a sort of a colony, as it's pretty clear. Are the Iranians going to play ball with us on that and make Chabahar some kind of a thing where our approach to Central Asia, which in some ways is an El Dorado? Last 30 years, I've been hearing that it's the land of milk and honey and gold and whatever else. I haven't seen that. Um, so I think those are questions which we need to examine when we talk about, whether we are going to align. And if we are going to be aligning, we also have to be mindful of the fact that there are interlocking strategic alignments which come into play. So we might want to deal with the Chinese as far as Chabahar is concerned, but then the larger India-China relationship, the strategic challenges which are emerging from there, and then when we need to build some kind of a buffers against the Chinese, how does that play out if we are going to cock a snook at the Americans? And then again, if Iran is so important to us, like I said earlier, what does it bring to the table? Whether in terms of remittances, whether in terms of our oil purchases, whether in terms of our trade with Iran, when you stack it up with what we do with the Arab world, it doesn't stack up to anything. And if we are going to start antagonizing, because if this is the time when we have to start picking up sides, can we afford to antagonize the Arab world um, for the sake of Iran, which really, when push comes to shove, has never really been our partner, notwithstanding all the nonsense about cultural and civilizational relations? Because if cultural and civilization relations are that Nadir Shah comes and butchers 100,000 people in one day, I don't know what kind of culture and civilizational relations we are talking about. So I think we need to re-examine all this rather than, those old strategic shibboleths which we have been nurturing.
But I'll but I'll just say that I think in terms of stacking up, this is an interesting argument because when even during the phase when the nuclear deal was being negotiated, I think in just in terms of raw numbers or raw data, it was very clear that our stakes were much higher in the Arab Gulf states than in Iran, and I think there are good reasons for that. Iran is not is an economy, and I think partly this paper also points out that it's an economy that has not really taken off. So in terms of economic interactions, your base is relatively limited. But I think even if you leave that, if you look at where our expat population, if you look at our larger interests in terms of what even this government has done with regard to UAE and Saudis, I think there is an expansion in terms of our stakes in the Arab Gulf vis-a-vis what has happened, what continues to happen in Iran. So I think just in terms of raw numbers, I don't think there is an argument. I think the larger issue about whether we can afford to completely ignore Iran and take sides with the Americans for and then chart out a course. I think that point is also well taken, because there are a number of people, for example, who have questioned whether, and this is not true only of India, even China, how long can you continue having good friends with Iran, the Arab Gulf states, and Israel at the same time? We like to say that this is something that is a strength of our foreign policy, but I think, and you see the costs also emerging very, very soon. So in terms of the decisions that you need to take one way or the other, whether this is the right time or whether this is something that provides you that inflection point, I think that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. But perhaps Mr. Mathai would like to talk about. This report does not look at it. We look at it primarily from the prism of Jcpoa and what it means for.
Yeah, no, I mean, just responding to that, I think the reason I raised that question about what the American intentions are was specifically to point the way towards this, that if their agenda is bigger than just this deal, they are going to be far more determined about it and far more watchful and tighter in the way they respond. And we have in Mr. Trump somebody who is more mercurial in terms of making these decisions than his predecessor. So if that were the case and we arrive at that conclusion, I would agree with you that we need to take a very hard look at our options and calculate where our interests are uppermost. And as you have spelled it out, I think the stakes right now with maintaining a strong relationship with the United States, with the Arab side of the Gulf. Our 7 million people are all in that part of West Asia. Yes, it certainly does stack up very much in favor of going along. The potential for Iran to be useful to us has been a bit of potential for a long time, but it will remain. So I would imagine that it would be best that we do not we work in a way that does not antagonize them beyond a point. There was a time, I mean, helpfully that is gone, when Iran actually did provide strategic depth to our neighbor Pakistan. There was a period in history. That period is gone, helpfully. We should ensure that these kind of things don't recur. So, but that's only a caveat on the negative side of not going a little too far. But I think to answer Suresh's point, the connectivity issue does remain important. It's not a chimera, Central Asia and the North-South connection. But I think at the end of the day, the Iranians are very hard-headed. And when the morning comes, they will again make calculations based on their own national interest and not on what happened in the past. That's my reading of the Iranian situation. But yes, we are in a situation where agreements, to answer the first question which came from here, the only cost of the United States pulling out in legal terms is that as long as the other partners carry on with it, it's still there. But if Iran sees this as a withdrawal, they could claim to be not bound by it any longer. But they haven't done that for very good reasons, because they know that they need to work very, very cautiously at this point in history.
Julia from Embassy of Iran. First of all, I have to thank ORF and distinguished scholars for convening this excellent meeting. I mean, congratulate you and the report. Of course, I haven't had enough time, and I didn't receive the copy earlier from my colleague and the ORF itself to go through very carefully, but I got the gist of that, and I entirely support the ideas mentioned. So I have a question and a couple of comments. I have to make it short. First question, I think the most important, solution that you have provided is number 3, and I will explain a bit regarding that one. And my question is that what are other methods and mechanisms that we can develop along the line of the suggestion number 3, because I feel that this is the most important, brilliant idea in this report, and I would explain a bit. We are, of course, India is going to have a good, move toward development, but in developing countries, we always have been prey and, the sort of victim of the policies in other sides. Let's say we had, the Pax Britannica system. There we had the rule, divide and rule. Then we had the Pax Americana, and then the offshore balancing. The developing countries, normally they divide and rule. How? They are dividing China and India. They are dividing Pakistan and India. They are dividing Iran and Sunni. They say Iran is Shiite and they are Sunni. So these are, in sociology we call cleavages. These are the cleavages that the developing countries, we have to be, we have to note this sort of ideas. And I feel that number 3 is catering for this. And I feel that this is the first time something like that is appearing in the Indian media, because normally there is sort of resistance. Even in my country, the dogmatic people and hardliners tending to say, okay, we have the issue of Shia and Sunni, or here, between you and Pakistan. I feel that the thing that in this report we have to build upon and work is that issue that we have to be careful of this sort of ideas, and then we have to provide further solutions. It is feasible. The idea of Iran as a friend of India, China, and Pakistan is that we can build upon cooperation, regional cooperation. We can take lessons from the Europe and the integration in Europe. They have set aside all of the military, strategic, and this sort of concerns. They build up upon the issue of functionalism and working together. We have to do that one. Why in Asia we cannot do that? Because of that divide and rule and now the offshore balancing. So we have to be very careful, and I'm very thankful for the important report for providing this idea that should be developed further. And my comment are regarding the issue of sanctions. We have to take note of the issue that what are the purposes of President Trump. My feeling, this is of course my idea, my personal idea. This I'm not speaking on behalf of Iran, and this meeting is under Chatham House. So I feel so. My feeling is that number 1 target for President Trump is Trump first, not America first, and that is, the issue of internal politics in U.S. President Trump is doing whatever he can to negate the discourse of President Obama. That is for sure. You can find plenty of evidences that first target by President Trump is Trump first, this sort of narcissism. And this is ruining the international world order. And we are, all losers, not only Iran, but India, China. I mean, these sort of policies are suffocating Iran, India, China, Korea, because, the issue of energy, we are exporters, you are importers, and then energy security is number 1 for all of us. And who is going to lose from this sort of, unilateral sanctions? We all. Iran first, India second, China third, all of us. Who is going to win? US. Why? Because they are suffocating the oil. They are, making problems in the Persian Gulf. And when these problems happen, we should pay. You should pay under the issues that my colleague, the DPR, has mentioned part of that. very eloquently why India is going to lose on this issue. So first Iran loses, and then other countries also. So we are, on this issue, we are on the same boat. So first target by President Trump is next election in the US to negate the discourse of President Obama, which was excellent for everybody, not only for Iran, but for India as well. If you go to the joint statement by US and India in 2016, simply compare it with the declaration in 2017. Just compare it. What you have taken from President Obama in the second declaration 2017? Nothing. What are the promises US has given to the India on the issue of nuclear plants? 2005, you are supposed to have rather 12 plants, nuclear plants to produce, generate energy for you. You got that? No, nothing. We have been betrayed under Jcpoa by President Trump. India has been betrayed. Paris Agreement has been betrayed. Other multinational agreements have been betrayed. So this sort of policies, selfish policies, neither, guarantee the benefit of or national interest of the US itself, because this is narrow and simple, ideas to serve the next election in the USA. So we have to be careful on that. This is not to the benefit of US and nobody in the world. So the America first and things like that, I think these are only empty slogans, and then we have to be careful on that. And if we go to, deal with the issue of number 3, there could be solutions, and then I hope that our, distinguished scholars who are dealing with ORF, I normally, have time to study the excellent studies on that. We can develop things on that. For example, how China, Iran, and Pakistan could work in Chabahar. Why some, narrow interpretations are that, okay, if China is coming to Chabahar, then how about India? It is not possible to do that one. So what about the history of work of Europe? What do you say? What is the purport of, cooperation, integral regionation, and all international, bodies and regimes? That is for cooperation. So that lacks in Asia, and we have to be careful on that. And one point raised regarding the issue of regime change in Iran, it was, I think the issue of regime change in Iran is naive, simplistic, and very childish. Because if you go to the, we had sort of a statement by our leader in Iran. If you go and refer to the statement, it is clearly mentioned that no regime in US, neither the previous ones nor this one, can change regime in Iran, because the regime in Iran after revolution is entirely changed with the regime before revolution. Now this regime, of course, this is I don't mean the negative connotation of regime. This, system in Iran is based on the people. We have, I have to flag another point here, that we are seeing sort of, media reports on internal politics of Iran. I suggest, and we in the embassy provide support for those who are interested to go to Iran and see and feel what is genuine in Iran. Because there is, for example, a small bomb going off or a small demonstration by sort of concerted action from outside, and then it is in the media chain that we know what are the media affiliations and paid to write articles, and then Reuters and things like that. We have to be careful on that. The nature of the system in Iran and support of system in Iran is entirely different with this sort of things. And then my feeling that I had, studies on the issue of structure of the system in Iran, and the support for the structure in Iran is strong. And I think the thing that has mentioned by our leader regarding the regime stability in Iran is quite pertinent. And the issue of regime change is a naive issue. And then if we want to go to the historic things like Nader Shah and things like that, I can provide plenty of examples. That is, we have to just ignore. And thank you very much.
That perhaps this is, while I like the argument about Asia should start thinking in terms of cooperation and regional institutions. I think looking at Europe at this particular point in time may not be the best possible option, given the turmoil that European regionalism is facing. But I think we have to learn it about ourselves. I think the issue of Chabahar is very interesting, and maybe Mr. Mathai may want to add something to that, because this is a challenge that we face. To be realistic, it has to, if it has to become a sustainable port, a sustainable sort of infrastructure project, then I think it needs greater heft. And at this point in time, I think what we have seen is at least this government in India did push this project, and the first wave was completed in December. So I think we have seen Indian commitment. One of the complaints from Iran has been that the project has been going very slow. So I think that has been sort of made a bit redundant now that we have sort of pushed on the Chabahar. But I think the issue of whether the possibility of the triangular cooperation that you are recommending exists is also a function of what other interlocutors might want. So it's not simply that we have recommended that. We have also talked about it in other platforms. And given, I think Abhijnan pointed out, the reset when Mr. Modi met the Chinese president, the talk was of having some cooperative project between China and India in Afghanistan. So whether that manifests itself in Chabahar, we don't know. But I think that the larger point here is that there are other interlocutors, China, Pakistan in particular, who also have to look at this project through the same prism. If we continue to look at it differently, then I think there are going to be problems, and this idea may not be sustainable. But I think I would like to invite Mr. Mathai to say something about this, and in particular, if there are possibilities of China and India doing some work on Chabahar together.
Well, I think the Chinese may not be averse to it, because they have, as they have made clear through the BRI, very keen to be expanding infrastructure development all over, particularly through their own companies. The point I was making was, to be of use to us, Chabahar, first of all, that deep water capability has to be maintained on a very regular basis, but that is something which would be a common interest with China. But would China have an interest in developing a road and rail connection from Chabahar to the Herat-Kandahar Southern Highway, which is what would make it significant for us vis-a-vis Afghanistan? That is not clear to me. That is a strategic interest of India. It's a strategic interest of Afghanistan. The Iranians believe that it is ultimately in their own interest also. But I don't think we have gauged, we have not heard from other parties who whether this would suit them. And certainly from the Pakistani point of view, while whatever they may say in declaratory terms, they see this as an immediate rival to Gwadar, and they wouldn't want it to actually succeed. So I think, yes, perhaps we could talk to the Chinese about it, but it will not be the project we have in mind.
So perhaps your good offices may help.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. I'm ready. And then I have an off-the-cuff suggestion here that this could be as a topic in agenda of ORF, and then I promise to get Chinese and Pakistanis also. Have sort of. I mean, this is a idea. This is a good idea. Why it is to the national benefit of India, Iran, China, and Pakistan? Why shouldn't we do that? So I would suggest that ORF would take the. I mean, we can have a meeting like that, and then I promise to bring other colleagues and if they're not interested.
Then I leave to Abhijnan.
What is the possibility of chances? Sorry, I'm Nawaz, and I'm from the International Committee of the Red Cross. What is the possibility of China being able to work around the sanctions and able to save Iran from save the nuclear deal? In case that happens, would India be willing to take sides, considering China's forays in the Indian Ocean region, Modi's speech at the Shangri-La dialogue, where he really looked at a very broad vision in the Indian Ocean region and a rule-based access, maritime security, etc. So, what is the larger role or sides that India will be taking in case China is able to save them?
So I don't I'm not so sure that China alone can save the nuclear deal. But you had your question had three parts essentially. The second part of that you said is what is the possibility of China going around the sanctions? As I mentioned in my remarks, there is a genuine possibility that in terms of the energy deals that are happening, Iran will accept the Chinese yuan, which then bypasses the dollar and the problems associated with it. And that's a real possibility. Now, whether India's position with China is linked to Prime Minister Modi's inclusive vision for the Indo-Pacific remains open. Parenthetically, one of the things that we have written elsewhere about is that in India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, Iran is an Indo-Pacific power, right? Which is not, by the way, not the case with the United States vision, which is different. So, I mean, can you include Iran in the Indo-Pacific construct and somehow bring other actors in? That remains to be seen.
China probably does have the capability. Whether it would want to get into a position immediately, I mean, I'm not talking about when it has got its hands full dealing with Trump's tariff war and all the other Indo-Pacific maneuvers, not just of the United States alone, but some of its allies. That, I think, remains to be seen. But I do not see China quietly acquiescing in the American sanctions so easily. They will try to find ways around it, but they may not seek to have a very overt confrontation at this point in time. And from our point of view, if they do, and it's played purely in terms of finding mechanisms to continue trading with Iran or continue the oil trade from Iran, there may not be any harm in our examining the possibilities of working with them. But in any Chinese effort to bring the yuan into the global system or to demonstrate an ability of leadership in this region, I would not think that is particularly in our interest, given the current attitude of the Chinese government towards India, notwithstanding Wuhan, notwithstanding the Shangri-La, etc., etc.
If you look at the sanctions in the past, I think one of the consequences of sanctions on Iran has been sort of the marginalization of the West and entrenchment of China in Iran. So I think that is of consequence to India, that is of consequence to a lot of the Western countries, including America. So I think it is enormously short-sighted to just view it primarily in terms of a bilateral matter. It has, if one is looking at the larger consequence of the last decade and the kind of relationship that China has built with Iran, so I think it almost makes you think that whatever may happen with this deal going forward, China is going to be even more entrenched, given the stakes that it already has in the country.
A very short question. It's regarding policy recommendation. Of course. So, question is, why do you think India should help Russia to create a SWIFT payment system?
Yeah, so the first of all, this notion of building an alternative to SWIFT was first proposed by Russia within BRICS. So this is so India, in some sense, was already party to these deliberations. Nothing happened there. The point that we were trying to make is that if unilateral sanctions become a norm going forward, right, and unilateral sanctions that draws in secondary sanctions, then people cannot. I mean, you have to do business, right? And SWIFT is essentially controlled by, it's a Belgian entity, but essentially controlled by the Treasury Department for all practical purposes. So if there are unilateral sanctions, you have to do something, you have to bypass it, right? So that's something that we have to go and examine.
Have we examined some of these possibilities in the past?
Well, I don't know whether we did very much on SWIFT, But if you look at the extraordinary lengths we went to maintain our oil trade with Iran during the 2011-13 period, 2010 to 2014, we did look at a lot of alternative mechanisms. We did, of course, get some waivers at that point in time, which disappeared. But there were a number of options which were looked at. And just it's worth recording, and I'll come to the reasons why we did it later. We actually found a system of paying through a Turkish bank for Iranian oil. When that was found problematic and problems were created over shipping, and then we mobilized our shipping industry to take the place and make sure that the tankers continued to come. And then the shippers found that the insurance companies went after them. So, it became a series of steps. Every step of the way we were battling. And I don't know whether, the critics of Indian policy at that time actually recognized the lengths we went to maintain our oil relationship with Iran. And there are possibilities today which may not have existed earlier. And the oil market is something which one should never rely on to be as liquid and as having all the options available as it is at a given present time. I was in Iran in 1990 when the crisis over Kuwait, etc., took place. And I know the desperation that calls we used to get from Delhi that will oil continue to flow. And I must say at that point in time, the Iranian government was very, very positive and said, we don't control price, but availability we can guarantee. Similarly, there were periods when, one country, you have Venezuela, Nigeria, somebody going out of kilter, and suddenly you will have a spike in oil prices. And we know now in our country what difference oil prices can make to the national life of this country, your budget, your ability to manage. So for that reason, I think keeping Iranian oil on global markets is fundamentally in India's national interest. And I think we should not forget that.
My name is Masood from Iran Embassy. Just a few points about this report. Kabir always interested to internal politics in Iran, but I don't think internal dynamic in Iran has any impact on our relation. As you know, I think the global order is the most important constraint factor on our relation, because before the revolution, Iran belonged to Western camp, and India belongs to Soviet Union camps. And after 90 years, India
officially non-aligned.
Yeah, officially, yes. And internal dynamic has any impact on our relation. And nowadays, Iran geopolitics is targeted by U.S. And I think that's has a as a security problem for India. And second recommendation, in case of use of rupee mechanism, we will face to accumulated rupees because the imbalance in our trade. And we can. It's important to think, how India can export, engineering service and manufacturing products to Iran, in terms of, power plants and railway. And thank you.
There's a lady in the back.
I'm a postgraduate research scholar. My observation is our India-Iran tie under American shadow. Like recently, when we see when Ms. Sushma Swaraj was giving the statement that India won't come under the unilateral sanctions and only accept those imposed by UN. But at the same time, we see that India's oil ministry taking decisions to reduce its imports imports to Iran, and also we see some of the private players like Reliance, who import oil from Iran have reduced. Is it because these companies have larger stakes in the US market? So, I would just like to know if you think that is.
I think they do, basically. And it's not just the larger stakes in oil, but their ability to pay. And anything, the moment you mention the word dollar, you get linked up ultimately to New York and to the system of controls. So these are companies who incidentally did continue to buy during the earlier period, but reduced. But yes, they are hedging to see what kind of options will become available for payments for the oil. I think that is the reason they are doing it. But yes, you're right. The External Affairs Minister's position is the stated position of the Government of India, that the only sanctions we accept legally are those settled and approved by the United Nations. But the reality of life in the commercial world is a different matter.
Can you introduce yourself?
Just because if one country withdraws from a multilateral treaty, it doesn't make the treaty void in itself. And the other parties are still not meeting their obligations under that treaty. So I'm wondering, how do you square the state's party to those treaties? How do you square the obligations placed from that treaty with the requirement to comply with sanctions? And what are the international mechanisms that can be activated to remove sanctions while states are abiding by treaty?
Probably you could mount a challenge in the International Court of Justice. But the fact is that you may get a ruling. But whether that ruling would, first of all, be binding on the United States Treasury Department is a question I can't answer. And even if it were, we know from earlier examples, Nicaragua, etc., that they have simply ignored it. But yes, you have a point. As long as the treaty is the agreement is in existence, the parties who have not withdrawn from it are bound by it. But whether they would mount a legal challenge against sanctions, I don't think in this real world they would want to do that.
But in this case, the argument is that they are trying to sort of rally around this deal. The Chinese and the Russians and the EU, the French and the Germans and the Brits have said that they would like this deal to continue. So they are trying to come up with a package. The problem is that it's not good enough, apparently, what they have proposed at this point. And I think we have heard from the Iranian government that what is being proposed is not good enough, and therefore, how do you move forward? And at the same time, what I think the earlier question pointed is the earlier question underlined. You have the private companies that are already deciding not to sort of move forward. So you end up in this conundrum that while technically the deal is not dead, yet for all practical purposes it's dead because the stakeholders can't really do much about bringing Iran into the fold or managing the private sector to follow through the commitments. So I think for all and let's not also suggest here that only America is the guilty party when it comes to international institutions and international law. Just because they are very powerful, so clearly they have a larger footprint. But I think international law is something that all states are for themselves. So if you see Chinese, what they did with the Philippines arbitration in South China Sea, they just ignored it, assumed it never happened. So I think international law still remains a very weak institution to a mechanism to sort of get states to hold to their commitments. I doubt very much whether there is any capacity within the international system to bring any order into that disorder. I still think that's still far-fetched.
And one reason the Europeans particularly have tried to do this package is that they fully understand that the obligations, if people are withdrawn from them, then the Iranians are also free to withdraw from the obligations they accepted. So for them, that is a very big question. Do we formally allow that to happen? Clearly, it's not in their interest.
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you. I am Javad Torabi. I'm a student. First of all, thanks for this very timely report. And I would like to know your comments on a couple of issues. We recently heard that Iranian president threatened closure of Hormuz Strait. Though it is not very practical, but how that possibly can affect the India's position on the JCPOA and relation with Iran. Second, on the support of Russia and Russia's position, probably not the best partner for Iran because they have already allowing Israel, for example, to target Iranian forces in Syria. Today, Netanyahu and President Putin are meeting, and even Russia showed positive signs that it can replace Iran in the oil market. That is another issue that I would like to know your comment. And the third thing on Chabahar, as a major point that India has to support JCPOA. However, I am myself from Afghanistan, and I feel that in our two countries, there is a very optimistic, too much optimistic perhaps, view of the Chabahar. I've written recently a piece arguing that it may become a second Gwadar for Afghanistan. The bilateral relation with Iran and Afghanistan is not very good. And we have concerns that maybe, like Pakistan, Iran also is willing to use Chabahar as a bargaining point. So how do you see also future of Chabahar in the long term? Thank you.
I think I've already expressed my views on Chabahar. At least it would give Afghanistan a second option, which for sea-based trade. And I think critical to it is the kind of linkages that develop from Chabahar going into Afghanistan. But what was the first question?
Straits of Hormuz.
Well, I do not recall having seen this, but that would be a very extraordinary situation. And I think it's not just how India would react, it's the entire world would react. But I think it's a hypothetical question, so I don't think I'd want to go there.
Yes, I think that's that comment was there in the media, and it would be quite extraordinary if that happens. But I think that's also the Chinese, I think, president reacted to it very strongly when he said that this kind of conversation should not happen because there's no need for making these threats. So I'm because that would in a sense be a declaration of war in many ways on a lot of these on a lot of the neighbors as well as major powers who use that regularly. So I doubt whether it can be just a negotiating tactic if that is the case. I think Iran Afghan relations have entered an interesting phase, and I think there is more dissonance now than we have seen in the recent past. So Chabahar, I agree. I think we tend to be more optimistic than the reality, either on the ground or in terms of the bilateral relations expressed. But I think what we were earlier talking about was the potential. If we can use Chabahar as a mechanism by which we can generate greater confidence. There are aspects on both sides. You can be negative about it, and I think there are a long list of negatives. But I think in this, as we are grappling with the challenges here, I think that also presents you a possibility which can be used by various stakeholders, and that's why we sort of we brought this out here. And I think our conversation earlier with our Iranian colleague also points to some understanding that potentially has a potential. Now there are underlying challenges, there are underlying differences between how China views that, how India views that program, and also of how Afghanistan looks at Chabahar. So if there are concerns in Afghanistan, perhaps that would in itself mean that the project will have to be reimagined in some ways. But I think what we were pointing out were really the policy option in terms of what Chabahar means and what in fact India's investment there means that India is keen on getting something out of that. So if you have a collapse around JCPOA, then perhaps that can be used or as an instrument for for creating the positive externalities. So that's that. And I agree, I think the underlying realities are very challenging at this point.
On Russia,
Oh, sorry, what was the, can you repeat that?
Russia, there were some talks about supporting the position of Russia and President Putin and President Trump, maybe talking about Iran in Finland.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, however, Russia itself is showing signs that it may want to replace Iran in the oil market, and they very much are keen to it, and Iranian authorities are upset about that.
Yes, I think Mr. Mathai made an interesting observation. Let's wait and watch and see what comes out of the summit, because there are straws in the wind, as he put it earlier, that Russians are making some of these changes despite their public declaratory rhetoric around their relationship with Iran. So we'll see what emerges out of this, and if this happens, then this will be a very interesting shift in the Middle Eastern dynamic. But would you like to add something to that?
Just this, that I think they would like to at this point, when the two leaders are meeting, explore the possibility of getting the United States out of the CA, TSA, whatever that is, as it applies to Russia. That would be their priority number one, rather than how it affects other countries. So yes, they would be willing to keep the oil market supplied. They would be willing to look at ways in which the United States is able to extend its reach.
Thank you for the remarks. It's very timely report. Two things I just want to touch upon. So we're examining the relationship in a broader context. In the context of just relations within Western Asia, how does India balance its relationship with Iran and Israel? And has there been any sort of notion that exists that Israel has pressurized India to back off from its relations with Iran? Because Israel right now is playing a very important role in America's policy in the region. So does India find itself to be a similar conundrum that where it has to also satisfy its defense interests with Israel and its economic interests in Iran? Secondly, touching upon the point made earlier about giving money for Iranian oil purchases in yuan, will that change the dynamics of Western Asia as well if there's a competition between countries that are selling oil in yuan compared to the usual standard of the US dollar? Is that going to be a acceptable path forward? Will countries like India go forward and pay in yuan, or any other country that does not agree with such American positions?
To touch on your first part, does India see a tension between its dealings with Israel and Iran? No, India doesn't, right? And to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any instance where Israel has asked India that don't deal with Iran. Because Indian policy in that region, as you very well know, is a multi-vectored policy. So we engage with Israel, we engage with Palestine, right? We engage with Saudis. So I don't think that that's an issue. I like your second question a little better on what does it mean if oil payments start happening in one. Now, oil markets, typically global oil markets and the main cartels price oil in US dollars. So one will be a stopgap currency, right? But there is a larger story to the use of one, potential use of one to buy Iranian oil, which is that as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese have pushed for internationalization of the yuan quite seriously. So now you have local currency bonds that the Chinese are issuing, so you can buy bonds in RMB offshore outside China. You also have other mechanisms through which the RMB is being used. So this would be yet another instance, and that strengthens the RMB's role, which, as Ambassador Mathai pointed out, is probably not in India's interest in the long run. Already, if you recall, a couple of years ago, the RMB was share in the SDR grew, right? Or RMB was introduced, sorry, in the SDR rather. So this would be the latest spec. But I don't think it will become a permanent feature. I don't think you're going to see oil markets suddenly marking barrel prices in RMB, but mostly as a bilateral one-on-one stopgap measure, right?
Would you like to add something on Israel, Iran, India dynamic?
No, I think we've had some fairly robust discussions with the Israelis. But I don't think they've ever pitched formally a kind of requirement for India. I think they view their relationship with India as being so important, particularly for their defense sales, that they would not jeopardize that. They would not. So, but they do express their views about Iran being the primary source of terrorism in the region, to which we have a very quick reply that we do not think Iran is actually the primary source. We have another party who can stake claim there, and then they fall silent. So yes, but we do have discussions, and it is an area where we do not necessarily agree. But it has not affected our relationship. They are not, I mean, they do from time to time talk, and so do we.
For the presentation. I just have one question for Mr. Mathai with regards to the discussions we're having on Chabahar. Is infrastructure development a zero-sum game, in your view? Is infrastructure development becoming a zero-sum game?
No.
Thank you. Sorry to take the floor again, but I feel that I have heard a good. One is regarding the nature of the relation between Iran and India. I feel there was something mentioned by Harsh that there is a sort of criticism or that one. There was a misunderstanding regarding the statement of DPR embassy. And it was purely the misunderstanding by media and interpretation of that. So Iran and India never had sort of criticism or this sort of thing. And our feeling is we have established this with NBA colleagues, and then we have cooperation that our relations are not dependent on the third parties. So the issue of third parties is the sovereignty of the countries. India has the sovereign right to do whatever with this relation, and we do respect that, and India is doing the same with us. So we have this sort of feeling between Iran and India that our relation is complementary, and we never criticize, and we never do that because the nature of culture, geopolitics of India and Iran in the region is complementing each other, and we should never go to that one. But of course, we have other factors coming to this area and then meddling with creating sort of problems. And now it is obvious who's the role country in the international board, who is going to doing all international regime. It's not Iran. Anybody knows that. On terrorism, for example, we have been facing the issue of Daesh, and now everybody knows who has fought with Daesh, and we have sacrificed our personnel, our people, with the request of the Syrian government and the Iraqi government to root out the issue of Daesh. And Daesh is a common enemy for both India, Iran, and the entire region, and the entire world. So the issue of raid by Iran, that is a consensus resolution of the UN, has been tabled and sponsored by Iran, and then other countries like India all enjoy that, and that is the same feeling between us. The second point is regarding the internal politics in Iran and the side effect of these new sanctions. There was a very important question by our distinguished colleague, I do not remember her name, regarding this new regime. The new regime, I have to flag this issue that the new regime, of course, the Jcpoa is not a legal agreement. It is joint program of action, and we simply didn't call it an agreement because there are sort of legal points to that. But we have a complementary document to that, and that is UN resolution, security resolution, that is going to be binding for all countries. And so far, and the difference between the new sanctions with the previous sanction is that this time we do not have international consensus against Iran. And the international consensus now is against the US, who's the breaching partner to this agreement. So this is the important issue that we have to know. And regarding the side effect of the sanctions in Iran, we are witnessing Of course, there has been sort of problems with Iran, and then we have to go to austerity measures and things like that. But there are, positive aspects also. For the time being, for example, the devaluation of Riyal has supported the export orientation. The export orientation in Iran has been boosted. So it is going to be very less, costly for Iran to export merchandise, non-oil export. And this is the advantage, and we have to pray God and then thank also Mr. Trump for supporting us to go forward to distance ourselves from the issue of dependency to the oil, which has been decreased after the revolution. Right now, it is rather something like, it is mentioned with different statistics from 40% to 60%. There are different issues, and then we have gone to the issue of tax. India has done a great job on that, the issue of GST, and in Iran we have been successful to go forward for the issue of tax and also the export orientation. Two cases that I can give you is that, since our Afghan colleague is also here, it is regarding the effect of the issue of sanction. Now, many we have been hosting 3 million refugees from Afghanistan. They are our brothers, they are in our schools, and we have good cooperation. These people now are coming back to, there are lines in the borders. They are going to go back to Afghanistan. This is good for Afghanistan and for us also. And there is another trend, and Afghan traders tend to, get much more commodities from Iran and to bring dollar to our. So this is, this is two, for example, two case and two advantages that we are getting from these sanctions, and we have to thank President Trump for helping us to get rid of oil dependency.
Look, the point is, if you're so happy about the sanctions, then I don't see any reason why we should oppose them. So, but the bottom line is that, we can keep talking about what the Europeans are going to do, or what the Russians or anybody else are going to do. But essentially, this is basically a fight between the Americans and the Iranians, whether we like it or not. And the Americans are able to push their way through. I don't see how anybody is going to be able to stop them, and at what cost. And every country will look at what cost they will have to bear if they're going to take on the Americans. The Europeans might do whatever grandstanding they're doing, but then they will have to see what I spoke about, the interlocking strategic linkages. They have their problems with the Russians. On their own, or all of them together, are worth nothing when it comes to taking on the Russians. So they need the back of the Americans. We will have to make our own strategic calculations, and every country will make their own strategic calculations. So I don't think there's an easy way out of this whole problem. The bigger problem is that if the Americans walk out of the agreement as they have, there might not be an incentive for Iran to carry on. But if the Iranians then walk out, then you are closer to the brink than what you were if the Iranians stay on. But why should the Iranians stay on? Because everybody else is, if they're going to toe the American line, then the Iranians are caught between a rock and a hard place. What are their options? So essentially, it's a messy situation, and I can't see any clear light out of the way. So at the end of the day, I think every country will just, protect their own backsides, and that's the way they're going to proceed. I don't see how anything else is going to happen. The Russians, if they can cut a deal with the Americans and dump Iran, I'm sure they would probably go ahead and do it. I don't know if they can trust the Trump administration to be able to do it, but I think that's the way the ball is going to roll, whether we like it or not. We might not like what will have to do, but then we'll do what we'll have to do.
So my question is basically, Trump's approach and his tendency to shake up the world order can be seen as an anomaly in otherwise consistent US foreign policy. So how wise would it be for countries like India and Iran to weather the Trump storm and just hope that he doesn't get re-elected rather than take sides.
Policy based on hope. In any case, we got
2 years to go. So that's a long time. That is a long time. But yes, you're right. It is an anomaly in terms of United States foreign policy. But we've seen similar, not quite as traumatic, but dramatic shake-up in the 1970 to 74 period, 70, 73 period. This seems to be something of a higher order. But it is one in which, whether you want to weather the storm or not, as was said, you do very, very careful calculation of where your interests lie. If some of the churning in that world order suits you, and certainly some of the containment of some of our major rivals to the north is not entirely bad from our point of view. So I would say we need to be very cautious in whether we declare it as weathering the storm or going along with what suits us. But that said, as the previous speaker said, everyone is going to examine their interests and carry on. But they will make sure they make clouds of rhetoric so that you don't realize that that's what's actually happening.
So I think we have come to the end of this conversation. This is a conversation that will continue because India continues to grapple with the challenge, and this the problem is not going anywhere. What we have done is try to put some ideas on the table to take this conversation forward as you go out from here. Perhaps there is a larger constituency out there that can debate this and even refine some of these arguments or critique some of these policy prescriptions. But I think it's important as a public policy think tank to put out some ideas that they may be controversial, but I think at least they take the policy conversation forward. So that's what this report has attempted to do. I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank the contributors to this volume. Some of them are here. Ketan is here, Kabir is here, Arshi is here. I don't know if Kanak is here, but there are several others. And those who are not here also, let the recording convey to them that they were duly acknowledged and they were duly thanked. Thank you, Mr. Mathai, for coming and sharing your views. Thank you, Abhijnan, for editing this. And thank you all.